In Confucian philosophy, filial piety is a virtue of respect for one's parents, elders, and ancestors. The Confucian classic Xiao Jing, a classic of Xiào, thought to be written around the Qin-Han period, has historically been the authoritative source on the Confucian tenet of Xiao, filial piety. The book, a conversation between Confucius and his student Zeng Shen, is about how to set up a good society using the principle of Xiao. The term can also be applied to general obedience, and is used in religious titles in Christian churches, like filial priests or filial vicar, for a cleric whose church is subordinate to a larger parish. Filial piety is central to Confucian role ethics. In more general terms, filial piety means to be good to one's parents, to take care of one's parents, to engage in good conduct not just towards parents but also outside the home so as to bring a good name to one's parents and ancestors, to perform the duties of one's job well so as to obtain the material means to support parents as well as carry out sacrifices to the ancestors, not be rebellious, show love, respect and support, display courtesy, ensure male heirs, uphold fraternity among brothers, wisely advise one's parents, including dissuading them from moral unrighteousness, display sorrow for the sickness and death, and carry out sacrifices after the death. Filial piety is considered a key virtue in Chinese culture, and it is the main concern of a large number of stories. One of the most famous collections of such stories is the 24 filial exemplars. These stories depict how children exercised the filial piety in the past. While China has always had a diversity of religious beliefs, filial piety has been common to almost all of them. Historian Hugh Baker calls respect for the family the only element common to almost all Chinese believers. Etymology. Filial piety is illustrated by the Chinese character Xiao. The character is a combination of the character Lao above the character Zi, that is, an elder being carried by a son. In Korean Confucianism, the character is pronounced Hyo. In Vietnamese, the character is written in Quoc Ngu as Hieu. In Japanese, the term is generally used in spoken and written language as Oyoko Uko, adding characters for parent and conduct to make the word more specific. Cultural significance. Confucianism. According to the classic of filial piety, Confucius once said, "In serving his parents, a filial son reveres them in daily life. He makes them happy while he nourishes them. He takes anxious care of them in sickness. He shows great sorrow over the death that was for him, and he sacrifices to them with solemnity." For Confucius, filial piety was not merely blind loyalty to one's parents. More important than the norms of Xiao were the norms of Qten and Yi. For Confucius and Mencius, Xiao was a display of Qten which was ideally applied in one's dealings with all elders, thus making it a general norm of intergenerational relations. However, in practice, Xiao was usually reserved for one's own parents and grandparents, and from time to time was elevated above the notions of Qten and Yi. Filial piety was emphasized in Confucianism because devotion to one's parents was often associated with one's devotion to the state. Buddhism. Early Buddhism did not have a strong tradition of filial piety. Buddhism in India involved many men leaving or abandoning their families, parents, wives, and children to become monks. The true Buddhist had to reject all family ties, just as they had to reject social and class ties if they were to pursue nirvana. Family was viewed as just another encumbrance of mortal life that had to be dealt with. Sorrow and grief were said to be born of those who are dear. Theravada Buddhism stressed individual salvation, and had little room for the interdependent society that Confucianism had created in China, which stressed the good of the community more than the good of the individual. In India, Buddhism also advocated celibacy among its monks, which was unacceptable in the Confucian worldview, given that it was viewed as the child's duty to continue the parental line. Introduction of Buddhism in China. When Buddhism was introduced to China, it was redefined to support filial piety. The Muzi Lifuolan, a work defending Buddhism to the Chinese, presented arguments for Buddhist monks' seemingly poor treatment of the parents. By closely reading the works of Confucius himself, the Gyangtu and Vimalakirtinirudesa Sutra are also Buddhist works portraying lay householder duties and obligations in contrast with pure monastic renunciation. The Muzi Lifuolan compares the Buddhist monk to a filial son who saves his father from drowning. A long time ago, the Qi people crossed a large river in a boat, and it happened that the father fell into the water. His sons rolled up their sleeves, seized his head, and turned him upside down, forcing the water out of his mouth, thus bringing the father back to life. Now, to seize one's father's head and turn him upside down is certainly not very filial, yet they could have done nothing better to save the father's life. If they had folded the hands and practiced the norm of filial sons, the father's life would have been lost in the waters. The behavior of a Buddhist monk is similar. While on the surface the Buddhist seems to reject and abandon his parents, the pious Buddhist is actually aiding his parents as well as himself on the path towards salvation. The Muzi Lifuolan also attempted to counter charges that not having children was a violation of good ethics. It was pointed out that Confucius himself had praised a number of ascetic sages who had not had children or family, but because of the wisdom and sacrifice were still perceived as ethical by Confucius. The argument that Buddhist filial piety concerns itself with the parent's soul is the most important one. The same essential argument was made later by Sun Chuo, who argued that Buddhist monks were working to ensure the salvation of all people and aiding the family by doing so. Hui Yuan continued in this reasoning, arguing that if one member leaves the household to be a monk, then all other members of the family would benefit from good fortune and lead superior lives, adapting their efforts. These philosophical arguments were not entirely successful in convincing the filial Chinese that the behavior advocated by Buddhism was correct, and so less subtle methods were employed to more directly give Buddhism filial nature. Passages and parables that were of minor importance in Indian and Central Asian Buddhism became very prominent in Chinese Buddhism. The Story of Shanssey is an example of this. Story of Shanssey. Shanssey spent his entire life aiding his blind parents until he was accidentally killed, but, because of his life of filial devotion, he was miraculously revived. This story was often mentioned in the Chinese canon of Buddhist writings, included in a number of different anthologies and referred to by other Chinese Buddhist writers. While it is clearly of Indian origin, this tale was virtually indistinguishable from similar Chinese tales. While the tale was transmitted along with Buddhist writings, philosophically it had very little to do with traditional Buddhism. The story of Moggallana. Another story advocating filial piety is that of Moggallana, a Buddhist monk who goes to great lengths to rescue his mother from condemnation for her unjust life. This story appeared in the Ulambana Sutra, and it is far more relevant equivalent to Buddhism than the tale of Shanssey, though it was still not a particularly important tale in Indian Buddhism. In China, however, these stories became not just elements of Buddhist scripture, but also popular tales which were even told amongst non-Buddhists. While these tales were a part of the Buddhist tradition, Chinese Buddhism raised them from a peripheral role to a central one. Other texts. Another tale that achieved great renown in China was that of the Buddha rising to heaven for 3 months after his enlightenment to preach and teach his mother his new philosophy. This tale was used to indicate that the Buddha did indeed show proper concern and respect for his parents, in that he cared for their immortal souls. A number of apocryphal texts were also written that spoke of the Buddha's respect for his parents and the parent-child relationship. The most important of these, the Sutra of Filial Piety, was written early in the Tang dynasty. This sutra has the Buddha making the very Confucian argument that parents made great sacrifices, and put great efforts into ensuring the well-being of their child. In return, each child must repay this kindness with loyalty and respect. Despite being a forgery, the sutra was accepted as accurate by generations of scholars and commoners, and it played an important role in the development of a fully Chinese variation of Buddhism. Other documents discussing the Buddha's views on the parent-child relationship were also probably forgeries. The Sutra on a Filial Son, for instance, also sounds far more Chinese than Indian and shows Confucianist influence. Ryukyuan cultures. Filial piety is an important element in the cultures of the Ryukyu Islands. It is the topic of half of the verses of the most popular Okinawan folk song Tinsagunyu Hana. Criticism. Luzon in his collection Dawn Blossoms Plucked to Dusk criticized the stories. He buried his son for his mother and Zhuangxiang. He lay on ice in search of carp.